A very good morning to you. We start with breaking news, and Poland has accused Russia of an unprecedented violation of its airspace and has scrambled NATO jets to shoot down drones that it says entered Polish territory. In the last few minutes, the European Union's foreign policy chief says they believe Russian drones were sent to Poland deliberately and that was not an accident. The incursion forced key airports in the region to close, including the main international airport in the capital, Warsaw. Well, in the last hour, reports that a residential building was struck in the east of the country, while a local prosecutor's office said drone debris has been found in the town of Szczecin. The president of Poland, Donald Tusk, posted on social media, last night the Polish airspace was violated by a huge number of Russian drones. Those drones posed a direct threat, were shot down. I'm in constant communication with the Secretary-General of NATO and our allies. Well, let's bring in Siobhan Robbins, our Europe correspondent. Siobhan, great to have you on this. The comments from Tusk and Kallas in the last hour suggest this was an intentional incursion from Russia.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key question when we look at now how will Poland, how will its NATO allies react, because it is all about what was Russia's intentions. And so we have seen in the past, for example, drones enter by mistake airspace of Ukraine's neighbours. But what we're seeming to hear now from both the Polish Prime Minister and also Kaja Kallas from the EU is that they believe that this was a deliberate targeting, essentially, of Poland. What I think is key to say is that NATO have said at the moment they are not treating this as an attack, and that means that we're going to potentially see a different type of response. However, if it is deliberate test even of how NATO responds, how the West responds, then that is still an escalation from Russia's point of view. And so we would expect now conversations to be going on behind the scenes of how to react proportionately, how not to make the war escalate further, but also to make it clear, to draw red lines to Russia, to make it clear that this is not something that NATO and its allies are basically going to lie down and take. And we know that the Polish Prime Minister is talking to the NATO chief. We know that it's talking to allies. So what kinds of things could happen now? Well, they could trigger Article 4, NATO Article 4, which basically allows them to have consultations with other members when a country feels that its security has been threatened. And we saw that at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Poland and other members triggered it then. Poland also looked at triggering it later in 2022 when a missile came over the border and killed 2 people in a border town in Poland. But actually, that ended up being likely to be a Ukrainian air defence, so they didn't trigger it then. But that's one of the things. The fact that NATO is saying at the moment they're not treating it as an attack, that likely means that we're not going to see Article 5 triggered, which is this collective defence. You know, attack one, attack is an attack on the rest. But we will now likely see some really strong reactions, because this threat to both Poland and the Baltic states is something that NATO and numerous European leaders have warned against. You'll remember actually that the NATO chief has said repeatedly that in the next 5 years, potentially even less, that Russia could be in a position to attack a NATO country, and they are the ones that are most at risk. So they will want to be sending a clear message to Russia. What kinds of other things could they be doing? Well, obviously they'll talk about how NATO responds. The EU will look at how it responds. And we know that already they're working on their 19th sanction package. That's expected any time this month. So that's one of the other things we could see. But it's clear now that lots of voices coming out from Europe and from Poland's allies believe that this was an intentional escalation.
Well, there's some more voices crossing. I just want to bring you this, Siobhan, and get your reaction. So Dame Melinda Simmons, she's the British ambassador designate to Poland, has tweeted, deeply concerned by reports of Russian drones over eastern Poland, grateful to Poland for a speedy response, awaiting further information from Polish authorities. The UK stands with Poland. We are waiting further comments from the British government directly. Also, we've learnt in the last few moments, Siobhan, that Polish F-16 fighter jets Dutch F-35 and Italian AWACS surveillance aircraft and also a NATO MRTT mid-air refueling aircraft were all involved in the operation. That's Reuters, according to a NATO source. And we're also hearing from a NATO spokesperson that they are meeting this morning for a regular session and will discuss how NATO responds to the drones that entered Poland overnight. I guess as the morning continues, Siobhan, we can expect much more detail of what happened, but also much more comments in terms of response. And it comes back to that very simple point. If this was deliberate, it's very hard not to see some kind of significant response from NATO, EU members.
I think that's right. What I don't want to do is preempt what that response is. But as I said, this is clearly an escalation if it was deliberate, a deliberate targeting, a deliberate sending of drones, because we haven't seen that in the past with Poland. I think what will change the way that they look at this is the fact that, as far as we know, no civilians in Poland have been injured. We do know, according to reports from Polish media, that a residential building was hit. But as it stands, we've been told that no one was hurt in that. And that would really change the calculation. And I think that's just a reminder to everyone at home that when you hear these warnings, the war is close, it could go into Europe. If you've heard it for a couple of years, you might be thinking, well, really, is it going to? But this is exactly the kind of thing that leaders are concerned about. That's something, there'll be a test, if it was a test in this sense, but someone will get killed and then we'll see a different kind of response. So it really is a serious moment.
Is, as you said, we've been reporting those comments from Donald Tusk, from Maria Callas, the EU foreign policy chief as well, Callas. And Tamara's just joined us as well, because she's been trying to get a specific comment. We've just reported that comment from the British ambassador designate to Poland. What's Downing Street saying? Yeah,
so she said that the government deeply concerned by these reports of Russian drones over eastern Poland, and they're grateful to Poland for their speedy response. I'm also told by a government source that the UK is in discussions with allies and stands with Poland as an ally. So it looks like that is going to be the tone of the response, and we'll await something more formal from Downing Street and from Keir Starmer in the coming hours, I think, as they try and ascertain what the situation is on the ground. But it looks like the position of the UK and allies is that to condemn the Russian incursions last night and to stand with Poland, which of course is on the front line of this conflict, in its response, which may well, escalate things.
Great stuff, Tamara. Siobhan, for now, thanks so much. Now, patriotism or provocation? they're speaking in the last few moments. It's in Polish. We're getting it translated. We'll bring it to you in a moment when we have it. Meanwhile, the British ambassador to the US, Peter Mandelson.
they will be and have been looking to see how does NATO respond if more pressure is put on directly. There's already this sabotage campaign running. So I think the question will now be, does this give an impetus to some kind of air operation? Does it encourage more people to join the coalition of the willing? Does it actually mean that European countries will decide that they will press ahead regardless of whether or not there is a ceasefire? I think we've seen that Europe is incredibly split on the risk it is prepared to take, but you can expect to see the countries on the Eastern Front, as it were, pushing for more work on deterring Russia.
Our Europe correspondent Siobhan Robbins joins us now. Siobhan, there's been so many updates coming from various leaders in the course of the last hour. The headline perhaps being that most of them think this was an intentional act by Russia.
That's exactly right. The more voices that come out of the EU, the more that seem to be pointing towards this definitely not being an accident. And I think that's really what we've been discussing over the last few hours. What was Russia's intention? Was this, as we've seen in the past, stray drones that have flown over the border that were targeting Ukraine but have ended up in Poland, or was this something else? And certainly the voices coming, for example, from the Vice President of the EU Commission are suggesting that they believe at this point that this was not an accident, was more targeted. And the question is why? Why are they doing this? And as you were hearing from your guest from Rusi, this is likely an attempt to test both the EU and NATO's resolve. What will they do now? And that's why we know that the Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, has been in constant communication with the NATO chief and that NATO are holding a meeting today which was already scheduled, and that they will discuss what has happened in Poland. Now, there's been quite an interesting tweet from Volodymyr Zelensky in the last few minutes, and he's put this: more information is coming in about the intrusion of Russian attack drones into Polish territory. As of now, it's known about 8 drones went in. Increasing evidence indicates that this movement, this direction of strike, was no accident. So that really reiterates what we've heard from other leaders. And then he sort of underlines what I've been saying. There have been previous incidences of individual Russian drones crossing the border and travelling a short distance into neighbouring countries. But this time we're recording a much larger scale and deliberate targeting. Now, I think the timing is interesting if this was, as is suggested, a deliberate attempt to provoke Poland and provoke NATO, because it was just yesterday that the Polish Prime Minister announced that tomorrow they are fully closing the border with Belarus. And that's because later this week, Belarus and Russia are carrying out some joint military exercises, which the Polish have said have termed as aggressive exercises. So is this Russia deciding to take this opportunity to push back? We know that Poland, from the start of the war, along with its Baltic neighbours, have been extremely hawkish when it comes to Russia. They're the ones who have always been saying, we need to do more, we need to act more severely, we need to improve defences, we can't give them any wiggle room, whereas others have been slower to come to that opinion. I think the other thing that's really interesting coming from some of those neighbouring countries, Estonia, for example, I saw someone from the Foreign Affairs Committee tweeting from there, them saying this isn't just a test of NATO, this is specifically a test of the US, because, you know, put your mind back just a few weeks now, and we're all hopeful that potentially could there be a step forward towards peace with this meeting of Donald Trump and President Putin. That just seems like a dream now, when we see a few weeks later what we're being told by one of the US's NATO allies is a deliberate violation of its airspace, a deliberate effort by Russia to escalate.
Siobhan, as always, thanks so much. More on that story throughout the morning.